All right. Good. Get going with Bible study here. We were going to go Daniel 8 today, and we will. But let's do a recap real quick of Daniel chapters 1 through 7. We were talking last week, and we were in chapter 7, and we should have done a recap to begin with anyway, just to kind of get everybody on the same page, everybody up to speed. If you have questions, we can answer questions. And just go from there, go into chapter 8. So, we'll do chapter 8 here in a minute. We'll do a quick recap of 1 through 7, and if anybody has any questions, just ask them. And some of this, the good thing about Daniel, it's one of those books in the Bible that you already kind of know something about it, like Daniel, the lion's den, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and the furnace, and all that. So we'll kind of cover all that stuff real quick. 1 through 7 recap. At this point in history, just a few little trivial facts here for you. This is about 537 BC. At this time in history, the Mayan civilization is flourishing in Mexico. When you're reading about stuff in Daniel. Aesop, you guys remember Aesop probably from your elementary school days, Aesop's fables and stuff. You don't know Aesop? Okay, you had that look on your face, I think. Aesop was writing his fables down. Confucius and Buddha both lived about this time in history. Yeah. And the Phoenicians, who we know of in the Bible, although I don't think they're referenced in the Bible as Phoenicians at any point. They may be, I'd have to look. It's generally Lebanon. And I believe they were Philistines originally. I might be wrong on that. But the Phoenicians, great seafaring culture in the ancient world, they had made their the first known sea voyage around to Africa at this time in history as well. The Greeks introduced the olive tree to Italy. And you have the construction of the Greek Acropolis during this time. So about 530, 500 BC, roughly in that period. And you guys know the Acropolis. It's one of those things when you look at anything on Greece or you watch a video or you open a book, that's the first thing you see is the big temple up on the Acropolis and everything. So,
Didn't they make is that the one that they have in Tennessee that they copied?
maybe, I'm not familiar with it. It might be. Does anybody know about that? They have like a replica here in the States, I think, or something?
Oh, what?
Yeah, Google that. I'm not, that'd be cool though. A bit of background to the background. This is kind of leading into the book of Daniel. We'll just get a little bit of history. After the reign of Solomon, the Israelite nation split into two different kingdoms. You guys are probably, vaguely familiar with this. Growing up, you hear about this, but we don't really study it a whole lot. We're not going to get into it today. It's just general history. The northern kingdom was called Israel, and it consisted of the 10 tribes. And the southern kingdom was Judah, and that consisted of the last 2 tribes. Both of these kingdoms would eventually be ruled by 20 kings. Out of the 20 kings who ruled the southern kingdom, the Bible says that generally 7 were considered godly. So 1 in 3 roughly, that's not too bad, I guess, all things considered. Although I guess the flip side of that is, it is Israel. You would think that all the kings would be godly, but apparently not. But the northern kingdom, out of their 20 kings, they had precisely 0 kings that were considered godly. They couldn't even find 1. So it's really not surprising that they fell into, they were conquered before the southern kingdom. The southern kingdom's downfall began probably for a number of factors, but one instance we know that in a moment of pride and worldliness that King Hezekiah, he shows the Babylonians all his his gold, silver, the armory, and all the treasures of the treasury in Jerusalem or in the southern kingdom. He makes a fatal mistake, basically gloating, being worldly, laying up his treasures on earth instead of in heaven. Isaiah then tells Hezekiah, hear the word of the Lord, the time will surely come when everything in this palace and all that your fathers have stored up until this day will be carried off to Babylon. Nothing will be left, says the Lord. And then basically the southern kingdom's downfall began shortly after that. Obviously, what can we learn from that short little excerpt? Hezekiah's courting and flirting with Babylon, which we would kind of consider the world, would ultimately lead to Israel's downfall. Even though his decision to do so at the time, he could not bring the consequences of his decision. We have a couple of life lessons for us. Unfortunately, a lot of times we see that in the church. We see in the religious world people like to dabble in the world. Like right up to the line and not cross it. The decisions you make today will ultimately impact your life, spiritual or physical, at some point in the future. And another lesson that maybe you can take from that, because Hezekiah was considered a godly king, he was considered a good man, but even a godly man such as Hezekiah can lose his focus and start taking pride in his worldly things, and we're going to kind of preach on that today as well. So hey, it's a lesson for all of us. We walk in the light, try to stay in the light. We all fall, we all come up short. We're all sinners, but we try to stay on the path. And sometimes even a moment of weakness can lead to big consequences. So, quick timeline of the events. I'm sorry, I keep stuttering. Of events going into Daniel. Nebuchadnezzar, the Babylonian king, deposes Jehoiakim in Judah in 598 BC. Zedekiah, the last king of Judah, is then summoned to Babylon in 593. Now remember, BC, your years go backwards, they go down. So 593 is closer to us than 598. And after BC, they go up. Okay, sometimes that confuses people. If you see something in BC, 600, as opposed to say 500 BC, 600 is further back in time than 500 is. He goes to 0, and then 0, the year of Christ or whatever, then it goes upwards from there. So 11 AD is 11 years after death, or after Anno Domini, whatever, after Christ. Don't let it confuse you too much. I know it confuses people sometimes.
I was just overthinking it because I was thinking what year was the first year of BC? Where did the countdown start? Where did they figure that out from? That's what I'm curious about.
Yeah, BC, you'll look, if you read a history book, you'll see 590 BC, then it'll say 570, and it's like, what? It's going back? No, it's going down to 0, basically.
I was curious when you just started counting down from, was it 9,000 or was it 9,000? Who knows?
There's been, I would have to study it personally, or chat, but there's been estimates on basically the age of the earth, the age of mankind.
They say that there's a conflicting, but it's either between 4,900 and 6,000 plus.
Yeah. So I don't get into it a whole lot because it kind of depends on who you know, but yeah.
Could we start with the Pangea era and then cross the Icelandic Strait, or is it after?
Well, it depends on if you believe in. See, that's the whole thing. The scientific view is that the Earth's 50 million or whatever years old. The Christian view is it's more like 6,000 or something. Yeah. So, yeah, it's not going to get into that because that's a whole other study in itself. But anyway, 588, Zedekiah rebels against Nebuchadnezzar and the Babylonians. The Babylonians siege Jerusalem. The siege is interrupted by the Egyptians in 587, a year later, by the Pharaoh Hophra. And that's one thing we don't, especially in the Old Testament, the nation of Israel has a very close relationship, bad or good, a lot of times with Egypt. At this time, they were actually allies, military allies. The Pharaoh Hophra and the Egyptians of that dynasty were allies with the nation of Israel because of Babylon. Babylon was rising in power. The Egyptians didn't want to be part of that, and neither did the Israelites because they had a symbiotic relationship. They were trade partners, the whole 9 yards. So Hophra and his army marches toward Jerusalem. Basically, the Babylonians lift the siege, say, come and get some. The Egyptians say, never mind. They march back to Egypt. They resume the siege of Jerusalem, take Jerusalem. Nebuchadnezzar enters the city and burns the temple. The first deportation of Israelites is in 586, the next year later. And then another deportation occurs in 581, 5 years later. Basically, that brings us to chapter 1 of Daniel. Chapter 1, short synopsis. And like I said, if you have questions or comments, feel free. We'll kind of go through it here real quick. Chapter 1 in Daniel, basically long and short of the chapter is Daniel and the Israelites are exiled in Babylon. The Babylonians start doing what is common practice at the time. This happened all the way up to the Middle Ages. Actually, it even happened in the last couple of hundred years. The practice of brainwashing, or basically what we would consider re-education camps. You know, the communists like to do that a lot. They did in Vietnam, they did in Cambodia. You're not doing what the government, the communist government likes. We're sending you to camp. It's not summer camp. It's re-education camp because you're not thinking properly. That's kind of what they did in ancient times too. The Babylonians took the best and the brightest from the Israelites, those without blemish, smart, intellectual types, those with promise, and basically wanted to integrate them into the government apparatus, into the societal apparatus of Babylon. They wanted to use these people. That's normal. Every culture did this. But that's what's going on in chapter 1. They start re-educating the Israelites. Names of Israelites are changed to Babylonian names. The captives are taught the lingo and they're taught to read the literature of Babylon. Some of you may already know this, but it actually talks about it in Daniel, like the name changes. We know Daniel, which I guess in Israelite is interpreted as God as judge, becomes Belteshazzar. I'm sorry, I never can pronounce that. Belteshazzar is his Babylonian name, and that means basically made belt protect his life. So they're giving them Babylonian names too. So they're trying to basically wipe their existence as Israelites, incorporate them into the Babylonian way of doing things, give new names. The individual we'll read about, that we have read about in the book of Daniel, Shadrach, his Israelite name was Hananiah. Meshach was basically Mishael, Mishael, that was his Israelite name. And Abednego was Azariah. So you may recall the name Azariah from the book of Daniel. That's what it's talking about. So that's basically the long and short of chapter 1. They're kind of re-educating the Israelites, trying to incorporate them into society. Daniel has a major test of faith during this period in chapter 1, not wanting to defile himself by eating the king's food. Because it was food offered to idols, and the Israelites were, we can't do that. We cannot do that. Daniel and his friends decide to take a stand. They will not eat this food. Basically, God rewards them for their faithfulness. They come through the test unscathed. That's basically the long and short of chapter 1. If there are any comments, we can get into it more, any questions or anything. Chapter 2, this is one of the most famous or infamous parts of the book of Daniel. We see where Daniel begins to rise in the kingdom due to the will of God. Nebuchadnezzar, in chapter 2, has a dream that he wants interpreted. But the magicians cannot do it because they do not know the dream. Maybe you remember this when we studied it before, or maybe you've read about it. Basically, Nebuchadnezzar has a dream. He calls his wise men, his magicians, soothsayers in. I need to know what this dream means. Of course, their response to that is, tell us the dream, king, and we'll tell you what it means. And he's wise to their game. He's kind of tired of these people, I think. Hard to determine exactly probably how he felt about it, but I think in that culture, the king is surrounded by court. You have to have these people in court. You have to have your magicians. your soothsayers. But he was probably a smart enough king that he was wise to what was going on with him. He knew it was a little bit of a racket. He wasn't going to play their game. So he has a dream he wants interpreted. They say, tell us the dream. He's like, no, you tell me the dream. And then you interpret it. And they're like, oh, wait a minute, you know. And basically Nebuchadnezzar says, okay, you're all dead. You're all going to be executed unless one of you can tell me the dream. They can't do it. Basically, Daniel comes to the rescue. And the rest they say is history. He basically interprets Nebuchadnezzar's dream for him and begins to rise because of that situation, because of that instance. Nebuchadnezzar realizes that he has the power of God in him, or at the very least, he's a very gifted individual that he can rely on. He begins to rise within the kingdom of the Babylonians there. And basically, the long and the short of the dream, the quick interpretation is, and this is his first dream. The whole book of Daniel is dreams, visions, prophecy. This first dream, the dream that we encounter here, it's basically the long and the short of it is he tells Nebuchadnezzar, this is a dream or a vision of successive kingdoms, with God's kingdom being the indestructible, the everlasting kingdom at the end that's going to subdue all other kingdoms. Chapter 3, a story we all know from growing up in the church or Sunday school when you're a kid. Basically, from the frying pan to the fire. This is the chapter of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Long and the short of chapter 3, Nebuchadnezzar commissions a large statue, golden statue, I believe it's of himself. Everyone in the kingdom is supposed to bow down and worship the statue. Daniel's friends won't do it. The king decides to punish them by throwing them in the furnace. And what happened after that? Anybody remember what happened after he threw them in the furnace?
The ropes burned off and came out. Where they saw an angel in there.
Yeah. God protected them because of their faith in him. Sent an angel into the furnace, and I think even Nebuchadnezzar says in the chapter, hey, there's 4 people in there. What's up with that? We only put 3 in there. It's interpreted as an angel came to save them. And obviously, this is another long-running theme in Daniel. Nebuchadnezzar sees the power of God. He's really good for a little bit, and then kind of starts backsliding. This is just like we are today. Sees another example of the power of God. He's like, man, that's great. You know, this is the true living God. Then he kind of forgets about that and goes down. Then he has to have another example. You know, it's kind of an ongoing process, kind of a microcosm of the world in general, from the beginning of time and even since Christians sometimes, unfortunately.
The three is a pretty amazing story, though.
Yeah.
Like, they knew exactly what was going to happen if they refused to worship the idols that the king had defined.
Yeah.
They knew exactly what was going to happen.
Yeah, there was no mystery involved there.
No. And they even said, and it appears when you read the text that there was no fear in them at all. But I'm just thinking to myself, there's no way you couldn't be absolutely frightened by what, but you knew that if you didn't do this, what the downside to it was.
Yeah, if you didn't do it, you were finished. And Nebuchadnezzar's punishment for them at the time was to throw them in a furnace. And it says that he heated it 7 times hotter than, he was mad. And it even says in the text, and I have to go back and look at the exact verse, where I guess Nebuchadnezzar confronts them, and they tell him what they have to say, and they're like, we can't do this. And then it says in the verse, his attitude changed immediately, basically. He was even more fired up. All right, fire the furnace up, get it up to 1 billion degrees, and we're going to take care of this problem right now.
Yeah, it was so hot that the guys that were taking them died from the heat, right?
Oh, really?
Yep.
I didn't remember that. Yeah, he fired it up. So, and obviously because of the power of the Lord, it didn't work out like he planned it to. But to his credit, he came around for a little bit. He's like, man, the Israelite God, that's the true God right there. And then he kind of starts backsliding after, the story of our lives, I guess. Daniel chapter 4. Basically, let's see. Nebuchadnezzar, like I said, he sees the power of God. He's acting, he's being good for a while. Now he issues a decree to the peoples, nations, and men of every language who live in all the world. May your peace be abounding. This is not the standard version I use, so the word is going to be different. But this is basically verses 1 through 3 of chapter 4. Basically, the king decrees about the miraculous signs and wonders that the Most High God has performed. How great are his signs and how wonderful his wonders. His kingdom is eternal. His dominion endures forever and ever. So you can see that Nebuchadnezzar is kind of coming around, and then, after a while, he starts to backslide a little bit again. And then later in chapter 4, he has another dream. Daniel interprets this dream as well. This is the dream of the great tree. He tells the king that the tree is him, and basically urges the king to repent of his sins and be kind to the oppressed, so that his prosperity will endure or continue. Basically, I guess Nebuchadnezzar did not do what he should have done, because we see later in the chapter that 12 months later, God's plan is enacted, or his vengeance is enacted on Nebuchadnezzar. Where basically it says later in the chapter, the words were still on his lips when a voice from heaven came and said, and the words were still on his lips. This is basically a reference to, at this point in the chapter, this is 12 months later, Nebuchadnezzar is basically on a balcony, I believe, or on a rooftop of his palace, and he's like, man, look at this, look what I have built, look what I have done, I must be the greatest. And God basically says, okay, it's coming, you didn't listen, you didn't play ball. Then it says basically a voice from heaven came. This is what is decreed to you, King Nebuchadnezzar. Your royal authority has been taken from you. You will be driven away from people and will live with the wild animals. They will eat grass like cattle. 7 times will pass by for you until you acknowledge that the Most High is sovereign over the kingdoms of men and gives them to anyone he wishes. The king is driven out and lives like a beast in the field, basically, until he is restored. You guys probably remember that study from that chapter where we studied that a few months back. Very, very bizarre circumstance there. I've read some commentary on people that tried to figure out what was wrong with Nebuchadnezzar. They think he had an illness of some kind, obviously mental illness of some kind. He thought he was an animal for a while. We just know that the text tells us that he's judged for 7 periods of time. We don't know how long that is. There may be some commentary on it. Some people have said 7 years. Could have been 7 weeks. 7 months. I have no idea. There's a long and a short, but it really doesn't matter. But the basic gist of the chapter is what we're focusing on. So Nebuchadnezzar kind of loses it. He goes out in the field. He's basically living like an animal for a period of time. At some point, he realizes what's going on. He gets his sanity back. God wills it back to him, and he's like, okay, what am I going to do? He's restored to the kingdom. And that's really about all we hear about Nebuchadnezzar in the Bible. I guess he dies probably shortly after that. In chapter 5, that's where we pick up next. Chapter 5 is the writing on the wall. And we talked about this a couple weeks ago. You guys probably remember this story. And of course, it's also a term we use today, oftentimes. Writing on the wall, it's a figure of speech we use to mean that it's evident. It's plain as day. The writing's on the wall. Everybody can see it. And this is what happens to Nebuchadnezzar's son, King Belshazzar. Is reigning now in chapter 5. Daniel again ascends within the kingdom. Now he's made known to King Belshazzar, who I'm sure he knew who Daniel was, but he had kind of cast it. I get the impression reading the book of Daniel that Belshazzar takes over power from his father. He kind of has his wise men, his council. Daniel's kind of thrown off to the side here, and I believe Daniel's pretty elderly at this time too. So Daniel's kind of doing his own thing, but King Belshazzar is at the feast. They're having a great feast. He decrees, hey, bring all the heirlooms and all the treasure that we got from the temple in Jerusalem. let's bring those out. We'll use those cups to drink out of, and those bowls, and we'll make a big spectacle and have a grand time. And it says in the text that he gave praise to the gods of silver, and the gods of gold, and gods of wood, and all these gods except for the Most High God, the God of Israel. So then he sees the writing on the wall. Daniel is summoned. He comes to talk to King Belshazzar. He recounts the story of King Nebuchadnezzar. Basically tells Belshazzar, hey, you saw what happened to your father, and now you're up here basically not acting right. You're not doing what you're supposed to do. You saw what happened to your father. It's going to happen to you. And he basically lets it rip on Belshazzar. And he says, because you knew all of this and yet have not humbled your heart, this is what's going to happen to you. He basically interprets the writing on the wall for Belshazzar. And the interpretation of the matter basically is verses 26 through 30. God has numbered the days of your kingdom and brought it to an end. You have been weighed in the balances and found wanting. You guys have all heard that term before. Your kingdom is divided and given to the Medes and the Persians. Then Belshazzar gave the command, and Daniel was clothed with purple, and a chain of gold was put around his neck. Basically, if you haven't read the chapter, Belshazzar says, look, I need someone to interpret this writing on the wall. I don't know what it is. No one in the court knows what it is. I need a wise man to tell me what this says, because it's obviously not good. I'll give purple garments, which, does anybody know what purple signified in the ancient world? Loyalty, yeah. And a crown, basically. I'll give, whoever can interpret this, I'll give him all these gifts. And that's what he does for Daniel. And he's a man of his word. Belshazzar, Daniel tells him what he doesn't want to hear. You're going down, sorry. He brings him his crown and his robe. He does what he says. A chain of gold was, or I'm sorry, a chain, not a crown. A chain of gold was put around his neck, and a proclamation was made about him that he should be the third ruler in the kingdom. And just like that, let this be a lesson to all of us. We talk about the second coming of Christ and how it's gonna unfold. You can't prophesy it, you can't predict it. It's gonna happen like the Bible says, like a thief in the night. Verse 30, that very night, Belshazzar, the Chaldean king, was killed, and Darius the Mede receives the kingdom, being about 62 years old. Basically, here's your prophecy. Later that night, he's dead. That's pretty quick succession. That should be a sobering thought to everyone. So that's the long and short of the long and the short of chapter 5, the writing on the walls. The main focus on that. Chapter 6, another well-known story within the Bible, maybe the most well-known story. Chapter 6, and that's Daniel in the lion's den. I'm not going to get into it unless anybody has any questions. Everybody knows the story. Chapter 7, here's where it starts getting a little more dicey. We talked about this last week. Daniel is a book of dreams and prophecy and visions. Chapter 7, last week we went into it, the visions of the four beasts, which are translated as the four kings / kingdoms that will arise after the time of, or during the time of Daniel and after, that will basically rule the known world. We talked about that. Chapter 8, that's where we are today. Chapter 8 is another chapter of visions and prophecy. So, it's a little easier than the last chapter, though. It's pretty straightforward. At least the first half of the chapter. Intro to chapter 8. While last chapter we looked at the prophecies regarding the four kingdoms, it's still primarily focused on the Roman Empire in chapter 7. In chapter 8, we deal with the Medo-Persian and the Grecian or Macedonian Empire. I was going to read it, unless somebody wants to read maybe verses 1 through 8 in chapter 8. This is basically the vision, and we'll read the vision real quick.
In the third year of the reign of King Belshazzar, a vision appeared to me, Daniel. After the one that appeared to me the first time, I saw in the vision, and it so happened while I was looking that I was in Shushan, the citadel, which is in the province of Elam, and I saw in the vision that I was by the river of Ulai. Then I lifted my eyes and saw, and there standing beside the river was a ram, which had 2 horns, and the 2 horns were high, but one was higher than the other. And the higher one came up last. I saw the ram pushing westward, northward, and southward, so that no animal could withstand him, nor was there any that could deliver from his hand. But he did according to his will and became great. And as I was considering, suddenly a male goat came from the west across the surface of the whole earth, without touching the ground, and the goat had a notable horn between his eyes. Then he came to the ram that had 2 horns, which I had seen standing beside the river, and ran at him with furious power. And I saw him confronting the ram. He was moved with rage against him, attacked the ram, and broke his 2 horns. There was no power in the ram to withstand him, but he cast him down to the ground and trampled him, and there was no one that could deliver the ram from his hand. Therefore the male goat grew very great, but when he became strong, the large horn was broken, and in place of it 4 notable ones came up towards the 4 winds of them.
Sorry, I had to read such a long
That's
section
all right.
there. I figured it'd
Good
be
practice.
easier. It would be easier than having multiple people try to read it. Any ideas, comments, thoughts on the first 8 verses? This is the vision that Daniel has. Go ahead, Gabriel.
Well, I imagine the original goat with 2 horns was just man being prideful and overly ambitious with their power, and then being humbled by the greater ram, singular horn.
Sort of. You're kind of on track. You're on track, but it actually relates to chapter 7. If you remember, and I know we got into a lot last week with chapter 7, but it's not exactly an individual that it's talking. It kind of does concern an individual. But basically, verses 1 through 8, the vision in chapter 8, the long and the short of it, the main focus is basically warfare or combat, right, between the ram and the goat. This is another vision of 2 of the kingdoms or 2 of the empires that we talked about last week in chapter 7. The ram is the Medo-Persian Empire. That was actually, I think, it was on their flag. That was their national emblem, was the ram. And then you saw in the verse where it talks about the ram having, I think it says 1 horn higher than the other. Again, another reference from back in chapter 7 of the Medo-Persian Empire, where the Medes and the Persians were kind of a coalition empire, although the Persians were the greater of the 2, and that it highly dominated the relationship within the empire. The Persians, all of the kings of the Medo-Persian Empire that you know of, that you've heard of, Xerxes, Artaxerxes, Darius, I just went blank on the Cyrus the Great, they're all Persian. So that's a reference to the Medo-Persian kingdom or empire. The other reference, the shaggy goat, is referencing Alexander the Great and the Grecian or actually Macedonian Empire, which I thought was kind of interesting. You can always read a lot into words and descriptions. And when I was looking at this, I thought that the description of the shaggy goat was pretty accurate. You guys remember what I said last week when we were talking about the Macedonians and Alexander the Great and his family and those people from that area? And it's okay if you don't remember, I'll kind of go over it again. But basically, a lot of times, the empire of Alexander the Great is often referred to as the Greek or the Grecian Empire. They weren't Greek, they were Macedonian. They were like the Lalus, Church of Christ, as opposed to the, Alamogordo being like the Greeks and all the affluent people. We're kind of like the country bumpkins out here in Lalus, which actually I take pride in that. I'm perfectly fine with being a country bumpkin out in Lalus. I like where we're at, and I like it out here, and but that's kind of it. Because it talks about the shaggy goat, and that's kind of how, like the Greeks, that's what they thought of the Macedonians. They were uncouth, they were uncivilized. They were on the northern fringes of Greece. You know, it's just those old Macedonians up there. You know, out in Wallows, just carousing and causing havoc and just being Macedonians. So it's interesting that the description is a shaggy goat. You know, that's kind of what I think of when I think of the Macedonian Empire. But in the vision, there's two animals. One's a ram, one's a shaggy goat. They're in combat. They're colliding. They're fighting. This is also a reference back to chapter 7. The shaggy goat is the Grecian Empire. The distinct, prominent horn in the middle is a direct reference to Alexander the Great. It mentions that it says that it seemed like the goat wasn't even touching the ground when they engaged in combat. It was like levitating across the ground at great speed. It's just a reference to the Grecian kingdom, how fast they conquered the known world, basically. Macedonia is this little area right above Greece. They basically took over the Medo-Persian Empire, Egypt, the known world in less than 12 years. And like we talked about last week, Alexander the Great died at 32 or something. Yeah, the guy was a boy genius as a general. But that's basically what the first 8 verses are talking about. The vision of the shaggy goat and the ram being the Medo-Persian Empire, the shaggy goat being the Macedonian. Any questions or comments or anything? I mean, it's pretty straightforward stuff. We're kind of back in chapter 7 again. It's just another vision. 2 different animals. They're not described as beasts in chapter 8. They're actually described as a ram and a goat. So, same concept, same people they're talking about, different vision. I'll go ahead and read verses 9 through 14 real quick. And out of one of them came a little horn which grew exceedingly great toward the south, toward the east, toward the glorious land. And it grew up to the host of heaven, and it cast down some of the host and some of the stars on the ground, and trampled them. He even exalted himself as high as the prince of the host. And by him the daily sacrifices were taken away, and the place of his sanctuary was cast down. Because of transgression, an army was given over to the horn to oppose the daily sacrifices. And he cast truth down to the ground. He did all this and prospered. Then I heard a holy one speaking, and another holy one said to that certain one who was speaking, "How long will the vision be concerning the daily sacrifices of transgression, of desolation, the giving of both the sanctuary and the host to be trampled underfoot?" And he said to me, "For 2,300 days, then the sanctuary shall be cleansed." Basically, verses 9 through 14 are talking about historical events that are going to take place. That's the one thing about the book of Daniel. When we read prophecy in the book of Daniel, we're reading historical events that are going to happen. Daniel is very accurate on just historical events that are happening at this time and that will happen in the future. Talks about the 4 beasts in chapter 7. That's the Medo-Persian Empire, Babylonian Empire, Medo-Persian Empire, Greek Empire, Roman Empire. Each one succeeded the other. Each one of them occupied that area of the world and then succeeded the next in occupying. Chapter 8, we're back at it again. He's talking about the Greeks taking over the Medo-Persians. They will occupy this area. That's basically what 1 through 8 is talking about. It mentions in 1 through 8, but it talks about the shaggy goat, and I believe it says the horn breaks off and then 4 horns come up out of the horn. We talked about that last week. That's a direct reference to Alexander's death and the dissolution of the Macedonian kingdom. It broke into 4 kingdoms after his death. The Seleucid Empire in Syria, the Ptolemies in Egypt, Cassander in Macedonia, and then Lysimachus in Asia Minor. The Greek Empire became 4. That's a reference here. 1 becomes 4. We know that happened through history. We talked about it last week. It's actually easy stuff. If you want to read a history book, you'll see everything they talked about in history. 9 through 14, it gets a little more dicey. It's not hard to interpret if you do a little background reading. Me and Mason were talking about this last week when he was here. He's got his opinions, I have some opinions. But basically, 9 through 14, I'm going to give you the historical, not the biblical. We'll get into some notes here in a second. 9 through 14 is basically talking about Antiochus IV. Antiochus IV, that was a Seleucid king after the death of Alexander, who they basically were in charge of the Holy Land at that time. He basically was a reprobate. He was a usurper. He was not in line for the throne. He murdered, bribed his way to the throne, and through money and bribery and other machinations became basically the ruler of the Seleucid Empire at the time. He was a very, very bad dude to the Israelites. He persecuted Jews heavily. One of the most famous stories on him was that he went to the altar in the temple in Jerusalem and sacrificed a pig. Outrageous to the Israelites. They hated this guy, he hated them. It was mutual. He was a very, very bad dude. This is generally agreed upon within most religious areas regarding this interpretation of this prophecy. I'm sure there are other people that have other ideas on who it is, but it seems like this is pretty straightforward, cut and dry. It's about this guy. He lived at this time. He was the ruler of this part of the former Greek Empire. It talks about the 2,300 days and how both the let's see, it was later, verse 13 and 14, and I heard a holy one speaking, and another holy one said to that certain one who was speaking, how long will this vision be concerning the daily sacrifices and the transgression of desolation, the giving of both the sanctuary and the host to be trampled underfoot? That's what Antiochus or Antiochus was doing. He was making a mockery of the Israelite, the temple, and the whole process of sacrifice. Basically, how long is this going to be able to go? How long is this going to go on before it's stopped? The reply is 2,300 days. Then the sanctuary will be cleansed. A lot of the commentary that I've read, and I've read from Church of Christ sources as well as non-Church of Christ sources, they're all pretty much in line with each other. The 2,300 days, if you take it literally, which we do, because it lines up with historical events at this time. 2,300 days can be taken figuratively. The premillennials. Some people with different doctrines or think about they talk more about the end of time stuff than we do. They think the 2,300 is a figurative number. They use it more in years, and that everything that this is talking about is talking about the end of time and things that are going to happen later that have not occurred yet. We take the literal approach. We can look at history and see actual events that occurred during the 2,300 days. That's how we interpret it. Now I'm open to discussion, debate, questions on it, whatever. We can talk about it. It's okay. It's not a life or death issue. We're just trying to decipher the chapter. One of the literal interpretations, if you take the 2,300 days as days, the cleansing is the focal point in history. That's what the last verse talks about, the cleansing. It's the focal point in history, and it did occur in 164 BC. That is documented in historical sources. If you go back 2,300 days, you get to the fall of 170 BC, where the high priest Onias III was assassinated by Antiochus's people. The following year, Antiochus loots the temple and murders a number of the Jewish people. The guy was very bad, very bad. Another literal view, the whole debate is the 2,300 days. Most people take it literally. The debate is on what exactly it means, because the 2,300 taken literally to one person is 2,300 days, cut and dry. 2,300 days. Count 2,300 days back, you get your time frame. The other literal view is not 2,300 days, but 2,300 evenings and mornings. God knows how to say days, but he did not say this here. This is a commentary I was reading. He said evenings and mornings. This is a reference to the morning sacrifice and the evening sacrifice that Antiochus had taken away. Therefore, we are speaking about 1,150 days or 2,300 evenings and mornings. With 164 BC as the time of the cleansing of the temple, that's the date we all know. Going back 1,150 days, this would be late 167 BC. As we also noted earlier, there was an important event in December of 167 BC when Antiochus set up a statue of Zeus in the temple and offered swine on the altar. This seems to me to be the most likely answer, however, both answers can be correct if possible. That's one of the Church of Christ commentaries that I read. Another commentary I read was not Church of Christ. They're pretty much lined up in the same ways. As I said, I think the vast majority of the people take this literally. The whole second part of the chapter here, the 2,300 days and all that, it's not a life or death thing. We're just trying to interpret the chapter. It's okay if you don't understand. It's okay if you don't know anything about history. And I was like, I don't want to go back and read all this. It's okay. We're just trying to interpret the chapter. So it's getting a little thick. It's getting a little in the weeds. But does anyone have any questions so far on chapter 8? It's okay if you do. We'll talk. Chapter 8, long and the short of it, it's another dream or vision being interpreted by Daniel, and this happens in the 3rd year of King Belshazzar. So basically, it's another recounting of something that happened previously. And he's basically telling Belshazzar, your kingdom's coming to an end soon. The Greeks are going to be coming through. You're going to be taken over. That's the long and the short of that. And then later in the chapter, he talks about the things that are going to be happening at the temple in Jerusalem and on the altar, the desecration, who the little horn is. Again, it's interpreted to be Antiochus IV Epiphanes. But again, not life or death stuff. That's basically the long and short of the chapter.
So one thing for those who have never gotten into the depth of Daniel, the important thing is to remember the context in which the people then would have been reading this. They would have known nothing about the leaders, specific leaders that were to come. The fun thing about Daniel is going back and looking at it retrospectively, and then saying like, oh wow, yeah, things did happen that are equal to this. But if you read this when Daniel wrote this and understood it from their perspective, what he is telling them is, at some point in the future, there is going to be a guy that is going to come who is not good, who is going to make your worship meaningless, or he's going to kick sand all over it, right? And it's going to happen. You know, when they say 2,300 evenings and nights, those people who are hearing it were just saying, that's a long time.
Yeah.
Right? That's the, sometimes we as Christians try to get into, and it's super fun, right, to get into the details of the historical references, but when you take in the context of how these people would have read it and received it then, it was more important to let them know and to help understand the things to come. Right? There's a lot of Daniel that is going to reflect into Christ's coming, Christ's kingdom, and that was important.
Yeah, go ahead.
Can you read Daniel 8:27?
And I, Daniel, fainted and was sick for days. Afterwards I rose and went out about the king's business. And I was astonished by the vision, but no one understood it. Is he talking about no one within the kingdom, or does he understand it? Yeah.
I don't think he does understand.
Yeah, I don't know if he does. And it says that he's perplexed. He's sick, he's perplexed, he's worried about it. Which is, I think, the same thing he said at the end of 7. He was worried about what's happening here. What does this vision mean?
Well, just think about what had just happened, right? He had given a prophecy to a king, and that night, the king was dead.
Yeah.
So that's on his mind when he's reading about this one.
Yeah.
And he's like, oh man, for a long time there's going to be some dude that is not cool, that's going to be very, very mean, and he's going to defile the temple and defile our sacrifices. Is that coming tomorrow?
Yeah.
I mean,
Very important. And that's, yeah, when I was talking to Mason about that too, that was kind of his point, was like, why was Daniel worried? If this is something that's going to happen way down the line, why is he worried? This is something that's going to affect them, those people, very shortly, you would have to imagine, right? And if you're reading the vision in 1 through 8 here, if you're reading this, like Chris says, how does this relate to me as a Christian? Well, I don't care about Alexander, because nothing's going to change in my life. It doesn't matter who's in charge. But now the second part is, okay, now that's a little disturbing. The temple's going to be defiled, and the sacrifice of a pig, and all that. That's going to affect me. That's disturbing to me if I'm an Israelite. So you have to look at it in the context of how it's going to affect you. And and I apologize if I got too in the weeds on the dates and the history and all that stuff. But yeah, there's a lot of studying this week to do that recap and get into chapter 8. And I read a lot. I was probably seeing double by the end of it. Not gonna lie. Yeah, we can just get into 15 to the rest of the chapter next week if you guys want to. We have a couple of minutes. We can take a quick intermission, and that's a good place to stop. Any other questions or anything? Yeah, Daniel, look a lot about prophecy and vision.